Very interesting there. Well, to our first conversation now, the IMF in its Regional Economic Outlook report released at the October annual meeting is predicting that the pandemic has permanently lowered the path of real GDP in sub-Saharan Africa, suggesting a loss of real per capita output up close to 5.6%. The IMF estimates that sub-Saharan Africa's economy will grow by 3.7% this year and 3.8% in 2022, but notes that the region is on a different recovery path from much of the world. Nigeria, however, is projected to grow by 2.6% this year and 2.7% next year. Yesterday, the IMF resident representative to Nigeria, Aisen, gave a breakdown of this report and what it means for Nigeria. He joins me now on the program to shed more light from our Abuja studio. Great to have you on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, great to have you. So, One Planet, Two Worlds, Three Stories, that's the title of the Regional Economic Outlook recently released by your institution. How does that describe sub-Saharan African economy at a time like this?
Yes, we have one world, and there are global problems, and the pandemic really showed us that no one is going to be safe unless everyone is safe. Also, we have climate problems that are extremely important to be addressed on a global basis. So the message is that we have only one planet, and all of us live in this planet, and we need to work together so that global problems have global multilateral solutions to it. Then we have two worlds, and it makes reference exactly to the point you were raising, because sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is growing at 3.7% this year, 3.8% next year, but other parts of the world are growing at much higher rates. So advanced economies are growing at north of 4.5%, 5%. Other emerging economies are growing at high rates. So there is a divergence that actually those countries who need to grow more are growing less to catch up in terms of income. So these are the two worlds that we are living in. And this divergence is, of course, very concerning. Then you have three stories. The three stories for sub-Saharan Africa is that this inequality is growing also within the region. Some countries are doing better than others, particularly those countries resource intensive are doing worse than countries without natural resources. That is one aspect. At a time that policymakers are facing quite a bit of what we call a trilemma or dilemmas or trade-offs on the fiscal side. The need to raise revenues, but the economy is still not growing at robust rates. There are spending pressures still that are there from various sources. And finally, you have already a debt position that for many of our countries is already stretched. So this is the second story. And the third story, that this situation that I described requires international solidarity. We have certainly been doing our lion's share, if you wish, of this solidarity by providing assistance. We have started last year on an emergency basis. The IMF has been in the forefront to our member countries, and more recently with the SDR allocation that I'm sure you also followed. So right. These are trying to help our countries face the dilemmas and the challenges on the fiscal side, but also restore some of the buffers that were actually used during these difficult times.
Quite a trilemma, Mr. Aisen. Well, recently the IMF in its Article 4 consultation has advocated for subsidy removal, and the federal government is attuned to this recommendation. Meanwhile, the government is proposing a 5,000 naira grant for the vulnerable in society to cushion, the impact of subsidy removal. What's your take on this?
it's extremely important to be able to cushion the impact of the removal of fuel subsidies on the poor and more vulnerable. And that's the whole essence of the problem. The subsidy itself benefits the wealthiest disproportionately. And there must be a compact where everyone is aligned and understand that that is a very regressive type of subsidy and not very well targeted. There are better alternatives if better target could achieve the goal of protecting the most vulnerable in society. The important thing also is that given the fiscal position the government has, it's very important, and how costly the subsidy is really important to remove it so that fiscal sustainability can be brought back to the forefront. So it's a dual objective, is to really ensure that resources go to those who need the most, and it's also to reestablish fiscal sustainability. So these are the important objectives of the fuel subsidy removal.
But there are also concerns that this 5,000 naira grant is not quite effective, for this situation. Is there a better way the government can actually cushion the effect of this subsidy removal?
That really that's a very good question. I think this is in the purview of other IFIs who are really studying carefully, particularly the World Bank, what are the best mechanisms that could really ensure an effective protection of the most vulnerable. This is essential for the whole policy to be successful. If there are, I'm sure that the government will be able to find out what would be the most appropriate ways of compensating. The important thing, again, is that this is targeted for those who need the most and not generally for everyone, including those who don't need a subsidy. And that is a very important point. If 5,000 nairas for some period of time will allow those most vulnerable to be compensated with the removal, I think that could be a good way to compensate.
Well, quite an expensive way, I must say. But the IMF also advised the CBN to adopt a free-float exchange rate regime. But, some would argue that this would push inflation further high. Government debt service already over 90% of revenue. That would go above 100%. How can the central bank actually navigate this dilemma?
First to correct, we are not advising on a floating exchange rate regime. Our member countries may decide if they want to peg to have a fixed exchange rate or a floating rate. I think what we are saying is basically two things, and we have said this before. First, and the central bank has started to do this, and we welcome very much, is the unification of the various windows into one window. That window has been the INE window, the investor and exporters window, where most of the transactions should take place. And this needs to be continued because there are still room to move in that direction. The second part is to flexibilize the regime in the sense that a market clearing rate is needed. And here, let me go a little bit in detail. Why is a market clearing rate needed? Simply because if you want to have an exchange rate that is below, it's not clearing supply and demand for foreign exchange, you need sufficient amount of reserves and buffers to be able to defend a particular rate. And this has been the story of Nigeria for quite some time, that many times you actually adjust the exchange rate precisely because you have run out of options given the level of the foreign exchange that you have available, particularly when a shock hits. And Nigeria has been vulnerable, susceptible to, for example, external shocks, particularly oil price shocks. So, you know, now oil prices have recovered. We are in a better position to adjust the exchange rate to clear the market between supply and demand. This is what we have been saying. As regards to the impact on inflation, some of the products are priced already at a higher rate. But you are right, and everyone and the central bank should be concerned about the impact on inflation. It's at the end of the day, one, if not the most important objectives of the central bank, according to the Central Bank Act. So it's natural to hear that concern. And here it's very important to be able, in case there is an adjustment of the exchange rate, to tighten monetary policy, to tighten fiscal policy, to make sure that all policies, trade policies, structural policies, come together, because the exchange rate by itself is not going to resolve all the problems. And you could have inflation. So being very, very clear about the fact that if you do adjust the exchange rate, you may need to pay attention to these loop-sided effects of exchange rate to inflation and react appropriately to contain inflation is essential.
Nigeria is projected to grow by 2.6% this year and 2.7% next year. We're already, you know, in the last quarter of the year. This certainly is very low compared to Nigeria's, you know, potential. But do you see this becoming, you know, a reality? And what factors will drive this growth?
Yes. You know, the last two growth readings were very positive. The Q2, second quarter, and third quarter, 5%, 4%. These were high numbers. A lot of these is because of the contraction of last year. So there are base effects. Having said that, also Nigeria demonstrated quite a bit of resilience. And in 4 quarters, that contraction that was the slump that we saw in Q2 2020 is mostly recovered in terms of GDP levels, no? But what we are saying is that these 4-5% growth rates are unlikely to persist going forward, because there are lots of technical issues of base effects that actually led to those good results. Given what we have seen so far, and we hope we are wrong, we hope that Nigeria always grows by way more than the IMF is forecasting, of course. That's what we all want. But based on the policies and the current policies, we think that this is more or less what we see in the horizon, 2.5 to 3% in the medium term. And here is the problem. Population is growing at 2.5%, so you cannot really have a meaningful impact on GDP per capita and income per capita if you're growing at those rates. So it's very important to grow at higher rates. In our view, that will require much deeper reforms, resolving the fiscal situation, bringing balance, making sure that fiscal deficits are lower so they don't pressure interest rates and the debt position, bring macro stability, monetary and exchange rate policies take a different setting, continue on the unification and market clearing position of the exchange rate, and improving access to foreign exchange to the private sector. And on the trilemma we mentioned before, on the fiscal, ensure that the solution actually is in the private sector for the trilemma. The more the private sector can be the engine for growth of this wonderful economy, the better. And in fact, that is exactly what it's happening. Growth is going to be fostered by the ICT sector, which is doing very well for many, many years. Agriculture has been resilient. It needs more financing. It needs support. Trade and other services and communication, a lot of base effects, but they are also strong drivers of growth. Other sectors need to join so this can be broadened as it is broadening, and we are hoping for more broadening going forward with a clear change in the policy setting and macroeconomic stability. The important also thing I should say is that growth, as high as it might be, must be inclusive. It needs to bring all Nigerians together and benefit everyone. Not only some should benefit. And if it's only driven by the oil sector, a capital intensive, there must be mechanisms, particularly on policies, to actually make sure that other sectors can benefit, employment in other sectors can grow, and labor-intensive sectors, particularly SMEs, can also benefit from the higher growth rate.
All right, Mr. Aisen, quite a lot to do there. Well, we'll keep our outlook positive for the country. Thank you so much for coming on the program, Mr. Ari Aisen, IMF resident representative to Nigeria. Thank you for coming on Business Morning.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with Channels again. Thank you.
Thank you.